Could you risk your life for a dying animal? This is the story of one fateful night when a man made a choice to open his door in the heart of Alaska's frozen wilderness, where the wind howls like a restless spirit and snow buries hope. A desperate cry pierced the silence. A massive grizzly bear, tears streaming from its eyes, carried a limp, barely breathing cub to a lone cabin. The man inside faced an impossible dilemma: step into the jaws of danger or turn away from a creature's plea. What he did next would change everything. Snow draped the cabin. The eerie howl of the wind and the faint creak of a door pulled you into the chilling Alaskan night. A moral question sparked curiosity, while vivid sounds, howling wind, creaking wood, immersed you in suspense. Mike Anderson was no stranger to solitude. A wildlife photographer with a weathered face and a heart full of untold stories, he lived alone in a small cabin deep in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. His world was simple: a creaking wooden cabin, a flickering fireplace, and the endless howl of wind that carried the weight of winter's fury. Outside, the thermometer clung to -40 degrees Celsius, the kind of cold that bites through bone. Snow piled high, burying trails and hope alike. A storm brewed, ready to swallow everything in its path. Mike's only companions were his photographs, snapshots of grizzly bears pinned to the walls, their eyes staring back as if they knew his secrets. He had spent years capturing their raw beauty, their strength, their quiet moments. To him, they weren't just animals, they were stories of survival, just like his own. But that night, his cabin wasn't just his anymore. The storm raged harder, the wind screaming through the pines, when a sound cut through the chaos, a low, mournful wail that didn't belong to the wilderness. Mike froze, his breath catching as he peered through the frosted window. In the dim glow of his lantern, he saw it, a massive grizzly bear, its fur matted with snow, standing at his doorstep. In its jaws, it carried a tiny, lifeless cub, its body limp, barely clinging to life. The bear's eyes glistened, not with hunger or rage, but with something Mike had never seen in an animal before: desperation. Tears, real tears, streaked its face, freezing before they could fall. It let out a gut-wrenching cry and gently placed the cub on the snow, nudging it toward the cabin as if pleading for help. Mike's heart pounded. He knew the risks: a grizzly could tear through a man in seconds, and this one was no ordinary visitor. Yet the sight of the cub, its shallow breaths, its fragile body, stirred something deep within him. He thought of the bears in his photographs, the ones he'd watched raise their young, fight for survival, and endure. He thought of his own life, the losses he'd buried, the chances he'd let slip away. The storm outside mirrored the one in his mind: stay safe and close the door, or open it and face the unknown. As the bear's cries grew softer, Mike's hand hovered over the door latch. The fireplace crackled. The wind roared. The cub's faint breaths seemed to fade. This was no longer just a cabin in the wilderness, it was a crossroads. What Mike chose next would define not just that night, but who he was. Outside Mike Anderson's cabin, the Alaskan wilderness had turned into a frozen graveyard. The storm, relentless and cruel, had plunged the temperature to a bone-shattering -45 degrees Celsius. Snow fell in heavy sheets, erasing the world beyond the cabin's dim glow. In this merciless cold, every breath was a battle, every step a gamble with death. Deep in the forest, a mother grizzly and her 2 cubs staggered through the blizzard. Their den, once a sanctuary carved into the earth, had collapsed under the storm's weight, leaving them exposed to the elements. The mother bear, her massive frame trembling, pressed forward, her paws sinking into the snow. Her cubs, barely a few months old, stumbled behind her, their tiny bodies shivering, their whimpers swallowed by the howling wind. The mother's eyes, fierce yet haunted, scanned the white void for shelter. Her fur, caked with ice, glistened in the faint moonlight, each crystal a testament to the storm's brutality. One cub, the stronger of the two, clung close to her side, nuzzling her for warmth. But the other, smaller and weaker, was fading fast. Its steps grew sluggish, its breath shallow, its eyes half-closed as the cold tightened its grip. The mother paused, her massive head lowering to nudge the frail cub, urging it to keep moving. She licked its face, her warm breath melting the frost on its fur, but the cub's body sagged, too weak to respond. A low, guttural moan escaped her, a sound that carried not just pain, but a mother's desperation to save her child. They had wandered for hours, driven by instinct and the faint hope of survival, until they reached the edge of Mike's clearing. The cabin stood like a beacon, its faint light cutting through the storm. The mother bear hesitated. Her instincts warned her humans were danger. Yet the cub in her jaws was slipping away. She had carried it for miles, her teeth gentle but firm, refusing to let go even as her own strength waned. The second cub huddled against her, shivering but alive. She looked at the cabin, then at her dying cub, and made a choice no animal should have to make. With a trembling step, she approached the door and laid the cub on the snow, her cries piercing the night like a plea for mercy. Inside, Mike stood frozen, his hand still on the latch. Through the window, he saw the mother bear's struggle, the way she nudged the cub, the way her body shielded the second cub from the wind. He saw the ice clinging to their fur, the exhaustion in their movements, the raw love in the mother's eyes. His mind raced. A grizzly could kill him in an instant, storm or no storm. He'd heard stories of men torn apart for less. Yet as he watched the mother bear's tears freeze on her face, something broke inside him. He thought of his own losses, his wife gone too soon, the child they'd never had. He knew what it meant to fight for something you couldn't save. The cub on the doorstep let out a faint whimper, its chest barely rising. The mother bear stepped back, her eyes locked on Mike's through the window, as if she could see into his soul. The storm roared, the wind rattling the cabin, but the silence between man and bear was deafening. Mike's heart pounded. He could close the curtain, stoke the fire, and wait out the storm. Or he could open the door and step into the unknown. The mother bear's cry echoed again, softer now, as if she knew her time was running out. Mike's hand tightened on the latch. The struggle outside was no longer just theirs, it was his too. Mike Anderson stood at the edge of a decision that could end his life. His hand rested on the cold iron handle of the cabin door, trembling not from the -45 degrees Celsius chill seeping through the walls, but from the weight of what lay beyond. Outside, the Alaskan storm raged, a merciless beast of wind and snow that buried the world in white. The mother grizzly's cries had softened, replaced by the faint, heartbreaking whimpers of the dying cub at his doorstep. Through the frosted window, Mike could see her silhouette, massive yet broken, her body hunched protectively over her second cub, her eyes glistening with frozen tears. Every rule he'd ever learned, every ounce of training from years in the wilderness, screamed at him to stay put. A grizzly was no pet. It was a force of nature, capable of tearing a man apart with a single swipe. Opening the door was inviting death. But when Mike looked into the mother bear's eyes, he didn't see a predator. He saw a mother fighting for her children with a desperation that transcended species. Those eyes, raw with grief and hope, held no threat, only a plea. They reminded him of his own mother, years ago, sitting by his hospital bed when he was a boy, her hands clasped, praying for him to pull through. They reminded him of his wife, Sarah, whose laughter once filled this very cabin before cancer stole her away. Mike had spent years photographing bears, capturing their lives, but this was different. This wasn't a story. He could frame it on a wall. This was life, raw and fragile, begging him to act. His breath fogged the window as he pressed his forehead against the glass. The cub on the doorstep stirred, its tiny chest heaving with a shallow, faltering breath. The second cub, pressed against the mother's side, shivered violently, its eyes barely open. The mother bear nudged the dying cub again, her massive paw gentle, as if she could will it back to life. Her low moan cut through the storm's roar, a sound that pierced Mike's heart. He thought of all the times he'd played it safe, staying in the cabin during storms, avoiding risks, burying his pain in solitude. He'd survived, but at what cost? The emptiness of his life echoed in the creak of the floorboards, the silence of the nights. This moment, this bear, this cub, it was a chance to be more than a survivor. Mike's hand tightened on the handle. Darwaza kolna hoga, he whispered to himself, the words steadying his resolve. His training protested, never approach a bear, never interfere with nature. But his heart overruled it. He wasn't just a photographer anymore. He was a man who knew loss, who understood the fight to hold on to what matters. The storm's howl seemed to fade as he made his choice, replaced by a swelling clarity, a surge of courage that warmed his chest despite the freezing air. He grabbed his heavy coat, a flashlight, and a blanket from the couch, his movements quick but deliberate. The cub needed warmth, and fast. He didn't know if he could save it, but he had to try. As he reached for the door, he glanced at the photographs on the wall, bears fishing in rivers, cubs wrestling in meadows. They'd always been his escape, a way to admire life from a distance. Now, life was at his door, demanding he step into it. He took a deep breath, the air sharp in his lungs, and unlatched the door. The wind slammed it open, snow swirling into the cabin like an intruder. The mother bear stiffened, her ears twitching, but she didn't charge. Her eyes locked onto Mike's, unblinking, as if she understood his intent. Up close, her size was staggering, nearly 8 feet tall, her breath steaming in the cold, but her vulnerability was undeniable. The dying cub lay between them, a fragile bridge across the divide of man and beast. Mike's heart raced as he knelt, his flashlight casting a soft glow on the cub's matted fur. Its eyes fluttered, barely open, its body so small it could fit in his hands. He wrapped the blanket around it, his fingers brushing against its icy fur. The mother bear let out a low rumble, not a growl, but a sound of anxious hope. Mike spoke softly, his voice steady despite his fear. "I'm going to help you, little one. Hang on." He didn't know if the bear understood, but her stillness felt like trust. He scooped the cub into his arms, its weight feather-light, its warmth fading. The second cub whimpered, and the mother shifted her massive frame, blocking the wind as if to shield them all. Mike stood, the cub cradled against his chest, and met the mother's gaze again. The storm raged around them, but in that moment there was a fragile understanding, a shared fight for life. He stepped back toward the cabin, leaving the door open, an invitation for the mother and her second cub to follow. His heart pounded with the audacity of what he was doing, but there was no turning back. The music of the moment swelled in his mind, not a sound, but a feeling. Hope. Courage. Humanity rising against the odds. This was no longer just about survival. It was about connection. About choosing to act when every instinct said to hide. The mother bear took a tentative step forward, her second cub close behind, as Mike carried the dying cub inside. The firelight flickered, casting shadows on the walls, and the storm's roar faded behind the beating of his heart. Whatever happened next, Mike knew one thing: he had opened more than a door. He had opened himself. The wind howled outside Mike Anderson's cabin, a relentless beast clawing at the walls. But inside, a fragile hope flickered. Mike stood in the doorway, the dying cub cradled in his arms, its faint heartbeat pulsing against his chest. The mother grizzly loomed just beyond, her massive frame a silhouette against the swirling snow. Her second cub pressed against her side, her eyes still glistening with frozen tears, held Mike's gaze, not with aggression, but with a cautious trust that felt like a miracle in itself. The open door was more than an invitation. It was a leap into the unknown, a bridge between man and beast forged by desperation and compassion. Mike's breath steamed in the freezing air as he stepped back, leaving the path clear. "Come on," he whispered, his voice soft but steady. "Let's get you warm." The mother bear hesitated, her ears twitching at the storm's roar. Her instincts screamed danger: humans were not allies, and this cabin was no den. Yet her cubs were fading, the smaller one barely alive in Mike's arms, the other shivering at her side. With a low, rumbling breath, she took a step forward, her massive paws crunching the snow. The second cub stumbled after her, its tiny body trembling but determined. Mike's heart pounded as he led the way inside, the firelight casting a warm glow across the wooden floor. The storm's fury seemed to fade behind the creak of the door, which he left ajar, a gesture of respect for the mother's wariness. Mike's cabin was small, but he knew where to take them. The storage room tucked behind the main living area was his sanctuary for emergencies, a cramped space with a portable heater, insulated walls, and shelves of supplies. It was warm, safe, a haven from the -45°C death trap outside. He moved quickly, his boots thudding against the floor as he pushed open the storage room door. The heater hummed softly, its warmth a stark contrast to the icy chill that clung to his coat. He knelt gently, laying the dying cub on a pile of blankets he'd grabbed from the couch. Its fur was matted with ice, its body so small it seemed impossible it had survived this long. He wrapped it tighter, his fingers brushing its cold ears. "Stay with me, little one," he murmured, his voice a lifeline in the quiet. The mother bear entered the cabin slowly, her head lowered, her eyes darting to every corner. Her second cub stayed close, its nose sniffing the unfamiliar air. Mike held his breath, aware of her power, 8 feet of muscle and instinct that could end him in seconds. Yet she moved with purpose, not menace, her focus on her cubs. She paused at the storage room's threshold, her breath steaming, and let out a low grunt, as if testing the space. Mike stepped back, giving her room, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "This is for them." With a cautious step, the mother bear entered the storage room, her second cub trailing behind. She nudged the weaker cub toward the blankets, her massive paw gentle but firm. Mike watched, awestruck, as she settled beside her cubs, her body a protective shield against the world. The warmth of the heater began to work its magic, melting the ice on their fur, filling the room with the faint scent of wet earth and pine. The mother bear licked the dying cub's face, her tongue slow and deliberate, urging it to fight. The second cub, exhausted but stronger, curled against her side, its eyes half open, watching Mike with a mix of curiosity and fear. Mike sank to the floor a few feet away, his back against the wall, his flashlight dimmed to avoid startling them. The storage room, lit by the heater's soft glow and the faint flicker of firelight from the main room, felt like a cocoon, a place where time slowed and survival hung in the balance. He didn't dare move too much, but he couldn't look away. The mother bear's presence was overwhelming, yet her tenderness was what held him captive. She wasn't just a bear. She was a mother fighting for her children with a fierceness that humbled him. Hours passed, marked only by the storm's distant howl and the heater's quiet hum. Mike's whispers filled the silence, soft words meant to soothe. "You're strong, little one. You can do this." He spoke to the cubs, to the mother, to himself. He thought of Sarah, how she'd loved animals, how she'd have been the first to open the door. The memory stung, but it also grounded him, reminding him why he was here, risking everything. The dying cub stirred, its tiny chest rising with a slightly stronger breath. Mike's heart leapt. He leaned forward, barely breathing, as its eyes fluttered open, glassy, but alive. The mother bear let out a soft rumble, her nose nudging the cub, her warmth pulling it back from the edge. The second cub too began to move, its shivering easing as the warmth seeped into its bones. It nuzzled closer to its mother, its small paws kneading her fur. The mother bear's eyes, once clouded with despair, now held a glimmer of hope. She looked at Mike, her gaze steady, and for a moment, the divide between them vanished. It wasn't gratitude, not in the human sense, but an understanding, a shared fight, a mutual respect. Mike felt tears prick his eyes, not from fear, but from the weight of what was unfolding. He'd spent years capturing life through a lens, but this was life itself, raw and unfiltered, unfolding in his storage room. As dawn approached, the storm's fury began to wane, its roar softening to a whisper. The dying cub, now breathing steadily, let out a faint whimper, its first real sound since Mike had carried it inside. The mother bear licked both cubs, her movements slower now, exhaustion evident in her sagging frame. Mike watched, his own fatigue settling in, but his heart was lighter than it had been in years. He'd opened his door, his heart, and in doing so, he'd found something he thought he'd lost, purpose. The cubs were alive. The mother was with them. And the storage room, once a place for supplies, had become a sanctuary of second chances. Mike leaned his head back, closing his eyes for a moment, the warmth of the room wrapping around him like a promise. The mother bear rested her head beside her cubs, her breathing deep and even. The journey wasn't over, the storm might return, and the wilderness was still a harsh master, but for now, they had won. Man and bear, bound by a night of courage and compassion, had transformed the cold into something else entirely, hope. 2 days had passed since Mike Anderson opened his door to a mother grizzly and her cubs. 2 days since he'd stared death in the face and chosen compassion over fear. The storm that had raged through the Alaskan wilderness, burying the world in snow and despair, had finally relented. The howling wind fell silent, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Dawn broke over the horizon, casting golden rays across the snow, transforming the frozen landscape into a shimmering sea of light. The thermometer outside Mike's cabin crept upward, the bitter -45 degrees Celsius giving way to a gentler cold, as if nature itself was offering a truce. Inside the storage room, the air was warm, heavy with the scent of damp fur and the quiet rhythm of life. Mike sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his eyes red from sleepless nights. The mother bear lay curled around her cubs, her massive frame a fortress of love and strength. The dying cub, once limp and fading, now breathed steadily, its tiny chest rising and falling with newfound vigor. It nuzzled against its mother, its eyes brighter, its whimpers replaced by soft, contented grunts. The second cub, stronger from the start, had taken to exploring the blankets, its clumsy paws batting at the fabric as if rediscovering the joy of being alive. The mother bear's tongue moved gently over them, cleaning their fur, her eyes half closed but alert, ever watchful. She was no longer the desperate creature who'd cried at Mike's doorstep. She was a mother restored, her strength returning with each passing hour. Mike hadn't left their side for long, tending to the heater, fetching water, and even sharing bits of dried fish from his supplies, which the mother accepted with a cautious sniff. He spoke to them in whispers, his voice a steady thread weaving through the quiet. "You're going to make it," he'd say, his words as much for himself as for them. He thought of Sarah, how she'd have smiled at this scene, how she'd have seen beauty in this fragile alliance. The storage room, with its shelves of canned goods and old tools, had become something sacred, a place where man and beast had fought together for life and won. As the second morning dawned, Mike knew the time was coming. The storm was gone. The forest was calling its own back. He rose, his joints stiff from sitting, and opened the storage room door. The cool air from the main cabin swept in, carrying the faint scent of pine. The mother bear stirred, her ears twitching, her eyes meeting Mike's with a quiet understanding. She nudged her cubs, who blinked sleepily, their bodies stronger, their spirits revived. Mike stepped into the main room and opened the cabin door, letting the morning light spill inside. The snow outside sparkled, untouched except for the faint tracks of their arrival 2 nights ago. The world was new again, and it was time to let go. The mother bear rose, her movements slow but deliberate, her fur gleaming in the firelight. She nudged the stronger cub, who scampered toward the door, its curiosity pulling it forward. The weaker cub, still fragile but alive, followed more cautiously, its steps unsteady but determined. The mother paused at the storage room's threshold, her gaze sweeping the space, then settling on Mike. For a moment, time stopped. Her eyes, deep and knowing, held no fear, no threat, only a quiet acknowledgement of what they'd shared. Mike's throat tightened, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Go on," he whispered, his voice thick. "You've got this." She stepped into the main room, her cubs close behind, and moved toward the open door. Mike followed at a distance, his boots soft on the floor, his heart pounding with a mix of awe and bittersweet pride. The mother bear crossed the threshold, her paws sinking into the fresh snow, her breath steaming in the crisp air. The cubs bounded after her, their energy a stark contrast to the lifeless forms they'd been 2 nights ago. The stronger cub tumbled into a snowdrift, shaking its head with a playful snort, while the weaker one stayed closer, its eyes darting to its mother for reassurance. As they reached the edge of the clearing, the mother bear paused. The sunrise painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, the light catching the frost on her fur, making her seem almost ethereal. She turned her massive head, swiveling to look back at the cabin. Her eyes found Mike's, standing in the doorway, his coat unzipped, his face lit by the dawn. For a fleeting moment, she held his gaze, and Mike felt it. A connection that needed no words, no explanation. It was as if she were saying, "Shukriya." Not with human gratitude, but with something deeper, something that transcended the boundaries of species. Then, with a low huff, she turned back to the forest, her cubs trailing behind, and began to walk. Mike watched as they moved toward the trees, their forms growing smaller against the vast, glittering snow. The mother bear's stride was powerful, her head high, her cubs bouncing with the reckless joy of survival. They were a family again, whole and unbroken, returning to the wild where they belonged. Mike's chest ached, not with sadness, but with a fullness he hadn't felt in years. He thought of the photographs on his walls, the bears he'd captured through a lens. This was different. This was a story etched in his heart, one he'd carry forever. As the bears disappeared into the forest, their tracks fading into the snow, Mike leaned against the doorframe, a small, reflective smile tugging at his lips. The cabin felt quieter now, the storage room empty, but the warmth lingered, not from the heater, but from what had happened here. He closed his eyes, the sunrise warming his face, and let the moment settle into his soul. A heartfelt voice echoed in his mind, as if narrating the scene to the world. Sometimes, one step of humanity forges a new bond with nature. Mike stepped back inside, the fire crackling softly, the photographs on the walls watching over him. He didn't need to capture this moment with a camera. The 3 lives that had crossed his threshold, the mother bear, her cubs, had left something behind. Something no storm could bury. They were a part of him now. A reminder that courage, compassion, and connection could light even the darkest nights. He stoked the fire, the flames dancing, and knew he was no longer just a man in a cabin. He was a man who'd opened his door, and in doing so, had opened his heart to the wild. The forest stretched beyond, vast and untamed, but for Mike, it was no longer just a place of survival. It was a place of stories. Of second chances. Of bonds forged in the face of impossible odds. And as he sat by the fire, the memory of the mother's final glance burned bright, a beacon of hope that would guide him through every storm to come. Those 3 lives would live in his heart forever. The Alaskan dawn lingered in Mike Anderson's cabin, its golden light spilling through the open door, warming the wooden floor where a mother grizzly and her cubs had found refuge just days ago. The fire crackled softly. The photographs of bears on the walls were now more than images, they were witnesses to a story that had changed everything. Mike stood by the window, his coffee mug steaming in his hands, his eyes tracing the faint tracks in the snow where the bear family had vanished into the forest. The mother's final glance, that unspoken shukriya, replayed in his mind, a moment so profound it felt like a gift from the wild itself. This wasn't just a story of survival. It was a testament to the power of compassion. A reminder that one act of courage could ripple across the divide between man and nature, forging bonds that no storm could break. As Mike sipped his coffee, he felt lighter, as if the weight of his solitary years had lifted. The mother bear and her cubs were out there now, alive, thriving, because he'd chosen to open his door. He thought of the viewers who might hear this story, people sitting in homes far from Alaska's frozen wilderness, yet connected by the universal language of kindness. This was a story worth sharing. Not just for the bears. Not just for Mike. But for anyone who'd ever faced a moment of doubt and wondered if one small act could matter. It could. It did. And it always would.